never shine so bright as when shy modesty does shade the light. Veils add to the beauty, and the more we seem to court contempt, the more we gain esteem.
What is a sampler? A sampler comes from the word exemplaire and really means a sample of stitches. Now then, although we know that there were samplers worked many, many years ago, we've found fragments in Egyptian tombs. The earliest named dated English sampler is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and is by Susanna Bostock, dated 1598. The earliest form of samplers that we are familiar with are the 17th century band samplers. They are literally an example of stitching, so that they were never intended for framing. They were intended to be rolled up and kept for reference, so that you could compare, you know, oh, perhaps I shall do this band of embroidery on the cuff of my sleeve, or perhaps I shall have this motif here. Now, this particular sampler, it was collected around 1900s, 1910, 1920s by a very wealthy Viennese lady called Henrietta Schiff von Severo, who was a Jewess. And in 1939, when the Nazis went into Vienna, her collection of needlework was confiscated and was given to what is now the Decorative Art Museum in Vienna. It was kept there in very, very good conditions in storage until around 2002. So it had never been seen or exposed to light, along with the rest of the collection, for 70 odd years. The development of the sampler is absolutely linked to female education. In the 17th century and earlier, it was really only the very wealthy that even considered any form of education for their daughters. Fueled by the interest in education that began to take place in the 17th century, charitable institutions, private benefactors began to take an interest in the poor, and it was at this point that we had charity schools starting. Education for the young females was mostly based on their ability to earn a living. So it wasn't deemed necessary that they would learn to write. They had to be able to read so that they could read the Bible and learn issues of morality, and generally to go into domestic service. So the ability to sew and also to knit was extremely important, and many hours a day were taken up in the charity schools with the teaching of needlework, and with that samplers and mending and making of linen that the orphanages or charity schools could sell to raise money. Now, this is quite an interesting example. It's by Mary Flack and dated 1724. It's a continuation of the band sampler in the fact that it's rectangular, and it also demonstrates with the text that women's literacy was becoming more important. This is between the 17th century and getting into the early 18th century that women's literacy was reflected in the samplers. Also reflected are the words of the verse.
The fairest virtues never shine so bright as when shy modesty does shade the light. Veils add to the beauty, and the more we seem to court contempt, the more we gain esteem.
This is teaching young girls from the very earliest age the requirements of diligence and industry and the virtues of modesty, etc. Again, here's another sample of the same rectangular form, this time dating from 1702. It's inscribed, Abigail Munns is my name, and England is my nation, and Aldersgate Street is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation. And then below it has a little line that reads, a needle is both long and slender, it is a marker and a mender, indicating that needlework was not only a decorative skill, but also had to be used in the mending and making of clothes. It's also very nice that we know where she came from. Worth noting as well is the unusual line of figures, which I've never seen before, and I call strawberry pickers. The two female figures carrying a strawberry in each hand and wearing identical pink dresses and hats. And you can see again that the silk is extremely lustrous. This is called a whitework sample, and I really would like to show you this because it is very, very beautiful. It reflects the costumes, the lace edging on the cuffs and the collars of the 17th century. And to do this work would demand great skill. Just take a look at the rose at the bottom of the picture. The petals are all detached and made up of hundreds and hundreds of stitches. Now this is a sample that I really want to show you because it's worked by Katherine Crump in the first half of the 19th century, and is actually worked in the very street in which Witney Antiques is situated, which is Corn Street, and you can see at Mrs. Wells' school, Corn Street. It's not only as a testament to Catherine's work, but also an advert for Mrs. Wells' school, which some of the school teachers were rather smart, put on so that when the sampler was hung on the wall, the parents could say, oh yes, well, of course I sent my daughter to the best school, Mrs. Wells in Witney. Mrs. Wells moved around Witney a bit, and we don't know whether this is actually a picture, an image of her actual building where the school was, or whether it's an imaginary building. Certainly there isn't a building like this left in Corn Street. Esther Stewart embroidered this sampler in 1836, 2 years before slavery was abolished in England. I think it's a remarkable sampler because it's got such a strong image of the African slave that I find really very moving. No doubt Esther came from a family, maybe a Quaker family or very much an abolitionist family. A number of these samplers do exist, but they are quite uncommon. This sampler is by Edina Christian from East Bengal. Samplers of this type are quite rare because they really didn't survive due to climatic conditions. And you'll see the girl's name is Christian. She was probably given that name on her conversion. Now, quite one of the amusing things, I think, is that one of the first jobs missionaries did when they went out to such places as India was to set up a school. But the only people who were allowed to go to the school were actually already converted Christians or ready converts. Now, an awful lot of the girls said, converted to Christian. As soon as they'd had their education, they went back to their Hindu ways. And this is just a really rather nice example, written both in English and in in an Indian dialect. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about samplers. My name is Joy Jarrett from Whitney Antiques, Whitney, Oxfordshire. If anybody has got any questions or wants any advice, information on conservation, restorations, etc., if they contact me through the website, I'd be more than happy to help.